think Chris again has answered the question of money. There's only so much money available at the UN for development projects, and you have to prioritize. We have 500 projects being put on the table. Where do you find the money? I mean, people make promises to you which you won't keep, and that's been the consistent pattern of international conferences. You look at the recent G20 meeting, not the one in London, but the one before that in Washington, D.C., held in October, I think, last year. And a promise was made by the 20 of them getting together saying we will keep all tariffs at a standstill. We will not increase tariffs over the next 1 year on any item being sold, being involved in international trade. Within a week of that conference being over, 17 of the 20 countries had raised tariffs on one or other item. So much for keeping a promise. I mean, if they're not able to keep a promise within 1 week of making it, can you imagine when it comes to other development projects? The question is, are you strategically important to the big boys? If you're strategically important, they'll keep their word or try to keep their word and deliver the goods. If you're not strategically important, they say, look, I mean, somebody else will take care of them. It doesn't matter to me what happens to that country or this country or that part of the world. So I think you've got to make yourself attractive to the development partners. So sufficiently attractive enough for them to want to invest in you. And that, I think, is a challenge which most small states face, given the limited resources that are available today for development assistance.
Thank you very much. As you mentioned priorities, you also have the Millennium Development Goals, and those have very specific targets that have been set for 2015. And I wondered that to what extent does the SIDS agenda fit into the global agenda?
Going back to when you talk about the SIDS agenda, I'm certain that you mean the Barbados Program of Action, which was further supplemented by what came out of Mauritius. And I would say that the two of them are really, it is a part of it. They can be linked together. What we do find with the Millennium Development Goals, there are a number of specific sectoral areas. Gender, the question of improving the environment at the national level, increasing education, the question of HIV and AIDS and other diseases, just to cite some of them. But basically you find that many of the countries are seeking to undertake activities that would implement them. It also comes back to not insufficient resources. For example, in the health sector, many of the countries in Africa, if they can move away from the Caribbean for the time being, they just don't have the resources in terms of financial resources and human resources to really move forward. And I have to move forward in taking action to make progress on the achievement of the MDGs. And here again, I have to point back to the question of availability of resources. We are not 100% reliant on the partners, but if there was a partnership indicated whereby a certain level of resources were to be provided, and these resources are not being provided, then it becomes difficult for the, for the program countries, as we call them, the developing countries, to undertake work to meet those targets. So it is a real difficulty as far as the MDGs are concerned. Now that we have the financial crisis, the debate at the UN, and I would imagine in Washington as well, is to what extent will this make it much more difficult for the development partners to put even additional money, on the table to support work that will help countries move towards these, to achieving these goals. So if there's one point I would make in the response, is the question of resources, insufficient resources being available. Now, there was another part of the response that I really haven't touched on, and that is how the SIDS program of action is in fact linked to the MDGs. And I would say that they're linked in that a number of the individual MDGs, they also correspond to several of the 14 issues within the program of action coming out of Barbados. So if you find that with the MDG, for example, relating to gender, if you're going to be able to improve the number of policymakers who are women at a particular national level, then one would expect that those female policy makers at the national level will be able to introduce their own perspective on the issue, whether it is gathering water or potable water, or the question of fishing in a particular village. So in a real sense, there's an interlinkage. And it's a question of the leadership at the national level who will have to make sure that that linkage, is maintained.
Ambassador Menon?
I mean, I think Chris has answered the question comprehensively. The only additional point, if I make, is that within the UN system, I think the amount of resources and the amount of the structure that you have to support the SIDS is a very small structure. I don't think enough attention has been paid to developing the structure. I think we need to do a lot more to get the structure going, strengthened, with more resources, with more people. And because of the lack of resources and the lack of manpower, you find a lot of things cannot be done effectively. And that also means the SIDS will basically have to take it upon themselves to push hard for the kind of resources to be allocated to that particular part of the United Nations system dealing with their interests. And often we don't do enough of that. We don't get together collectively and push for our interests. We should go and insist seeing the Secretary General to say why is not enough money being put into the area where SIDS should be benefiting from. Why are we doing that? I mean, we should be doing things like that. We should be writing letters, insisting on things in our interest, but we don't do enough of that. And that's what I mean when I say collectively we're not banding together to push our interests and therefore lacking the heft or the influence that we should be having, should be able to demonstrate at the UN.
Thank you very much. Now I'm going to put open the floor for questions. Please.
Thank you very much. And thank you both ambassadors for these very insightful presentations. I surely did not go to sleep, I can assure you that. I'm very alert. But we've been looking at the inability of the small countries to make proper representations in these international organizations. And we have been, it seems to be pointing at the inadequacy in human resources in these embassies and permanent representations. And you've been talking about self-sufficiency. Self-sufficiency, I think you need to temper that a bit. I don't see us being self-sufficient in embassies and permanent representations like the bigger countries. It looks like if we need to find strategy to share what we have. Take, for instance, in Washington, I worked there for a long time, not in the embassies, but in the Organization of American States. We have to find ways, if we want to preserve our sort of national independence and pride. We want to have own embassies. But sometimes we cannot afford to have embassies of this number, size, as a big country would have. It's realistic. But what happened in Washington, I thought was a good idea. It started off, for instance, the OECS countries did something like they bought a building together. Whereas Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad, and have their own embassies and very proud, have their own buildings. And real estate in Washington is very, very expensive. The OECS bought a building and they kept together, well, as a group. For instance, ambassadors could just walk down the crowd and share some, or a permanent representative with other. They may share, a fax machine. But we got to be realistic and come to terms with our situation. Self-sufficiency, yes, but in a different kind of context. So I want us to look at that and to see to what extent we can move in that direction. There may be other ways where small countries like ours could share resources so that we make more appropriate presentation. We have similar issues in these forums. The other part of it is that when I think, for instance, of small states, and when did they first get recognition as small states? To some extent, it came from work like Willie Demas, and if you were of him, Mr. William Demas, who developed new theories of economic growth and development for small countries. I don't think he was working out of the university. He was not in an embassy. And what seems to be necessary, maybe institutions like the University of the West Indies or even the Institute of Social has to be with where intellectual resources reside, deal with some of these issues, come up with strategies, come up with analyses which the embassies could use or even the governments could use. So it may be necessary then for our think tanks, what we have back here, to understand this and make a better effort to provide our embassies, our representations with the kind of thinking that would be appropriate. So these are just two of the suggestions, but I think the Washington situation is one that we can try to duplicate, maybe try it in New York and other places. And the question of getting some of our issues addressed by persons outside of the embassies, outside of government, but feeding that information and those ideas into our embassies and representation. These are just two suggestions based on what I've been hearing here and also your very stimulating and non-sleeping presentations. Thank you.